Ladies and gentlemen, take a deep breath and imagine this. You wake up tomorrow morning to the relentless vibration of your phone. Notifications flood your screen. Breaking news alerts interrupt everything. Emergency warnings override normal programming. And 3 words dominate every headline, every channel, every timeline: World War III. Not a hashtag. Not a movie plot. Not a distant prediction debated by analysts. But a declared, undeniable reality. The question is not how it would look in a Hollywood film. The question is what would actually happen in the first 24 hours. Strategically, politically, economically, psychologically. Because modern global conflict would not unfold the way many imagine. It would not begin with dramatic speeches. It would begin with actions. Hour zero would be the spark. World wars do not start with press conferences. They begin with decisive moves. A coordinated military strike, a missile crossing a red line, a naval confrontation spiraling beyond control, or perhaps a sophisticated cyber attack crippling critical infrastructure. Within minutes of that first act, defense systems across continents would activate. Radar networks would illuminate with signals. Command centers would transition instantly from monitoring mode to emergency response. Leaders would be awakened by secure lines in Washington, Moscow, Beijing, London, and beyond. Emergency cabinets would convene. Military bases would elevate to high alert status. Fighter jets might be scrambled. Naval fleets would receive encrypted orders. The public might still be asleep unaware, but governments would already be moving at extraordinary speed. Between hours 1 and 3, the digital explosion would eclipse the physical one. Before bombs fully reach headlines, social media would erupt. Satellite imagery would circulate online within minutes. Unverified videos would spread rapidly. Analysts would speculate in real time. The phrase, World War III, would trend globally, almost instantly. Markets in Asia would open in visible panic. Oil futures would spike. Currency values would fluctuate violently. Safe haven assets like gold would surge. Airlines would begin rerouting flights away from potential conflict zones. Insurance companies would assess risk exposures. But perhaps the most critical battlefield would not be land or sea. It would be cyberspace. Modern wars begin digitally. Power grids could face disruptions. Banking systems might experience outages. Government websites could go dark. Disinformation. Campaigns would flood networks with conflicting narratives. Confusion itself would become a weapon. The goal would not only be to strike physically, but to destabilize psychologically. Between hours 4 and 6, alliances would activate. This is where tensions would deepen. Mutual defense treaties would trigger urgent consultations. Military alliances would assess obligations and responses. Naval fleets would reposition strategically. Air defense systems would prepare for potential incoming threats. Missile shields would move to maximum readiness. Nations not directly attacked would calculate risk exposure. Would they join? Would they remain neutral? Would they prepare for spillover effects? Diplomatic hotlines between rival powers would open immediately because even adversaries understand the catastrophic risk of miscalculation, particularly in a nuclear age. Global diplomacy would accelerate behind closed doors, even as public statements projected firmness and resolve. Hours 7 through 9 would unleash an economic shockwave across the globe. Stock markets in Europe and North America could plummet sharply. Oil prices might surge dramatically if major supply routes were threatened. Shipping lanes could face immediate scrutiny, especially if strategic maritime choke points were involved. Insurance rates for cargo vessels might skyrocket overnight. Supply chain anxieties would resurface with force. Inflation fears would intensify, and ordinary citizens would begin to feel it. Gas prices could jump quickly. Supermarkets might see waves of panic buying. Online retailers could report surges in emergency supply purchases. War is not merely fought with weapons, it is fought through economic disruption. Financial stability becomes one of the earliest casualties. Between hours 10 and 12, military posturing would dominate global imagery. Strategic bombers could be repositioned to visible bases. Aircraft carriers might move into high visibility zones as a demonstration of strength. Missile defense systems would operate at peak readiness. Military aircraft would patrol borders and contested areas. Yet, critically, both sides would likely avoid crossing the nuclear threshold. Nuclear weapons are not designed as impulsive first responses. They function primarily as deterrents. Their terrifying power creates a paradox. The more destructive they are, the more caution they impose. Leaders understand that once nuclear weapons are used, control disappears. So the first half-day would likely focus on conventional capabilities, cyber measures, and economic leverage, rather than immediate nuclear exchange. Deterrence would be the language of the moment. Hours 13 through 15 would bring the civilian impact into sharper focus. Governments would issue travel advisories. Embassies could recommend evacuation from certain regions. Airspace closures might expand. Families would contact loved ones abroad. Students would watch live updates in classrooms. Conversations about emergency preparedness would begin at kitchen tables. Should food be stocked? Should cash be withdrawn? Should contingency plans be made? Fear often spreads faster than verified information. Governments would urge calm because panic can destabilize societies faster than missiles. Maintaining public order would become a strategic objective in itself. Between hours 16 and 18, diplomacy would race against escalation. Neutral nations might offer mediation. International organizations could call emergency sessions. Back-channel communications between adversaries would intensify quietly. Publicly, leaders would present strength to reassure domestic audiences and deter adversaries. Privately, they would analyze risk matrices. Can escalation be contained? Can this remain regional? What are the red lines? The first 24 hours of a global conflict are less about achieving victory and more about controlling momentum. Preventing an irreversible slide toward catastrophic escalation becomes the central objective. Hours 19 through 21 would mark the psychological war phase. Governments would release carefully crafted statements framing actions as defensive or justified. Media narratives would solidify. Propaganda efforts would attempt to shape domestic and international opinion. Confidence would need to be projected even if uncertainty dominated behind closed doors. Citizens worldwide would begin asking whether this marks the beginning of something unstoppable. Psychological resilience becomes critical. Public opinion itself becomes a battlefield. As hours 22 through 24 conclude, the world would stand at a crossroads. Military forces would be mobilized, economies would be shaken, alliances would clarify positions. Yet, the first 24 hours would not determine the outcome of a world war. They would determine the direction. Escalation could intensify, drawing in more actors. Or diplomatic interventions could stabilize the crisis. History shows that several moments that appeared to be the brink of world war were ultimately defused through restraint, communication, and calculated compromise. The nuclear question inevitably dominates public fear. Would nuclear weapons be used immediately? Almost certainly not. Nuclear doctrine in major powers is built primarily on deterrence. The logic is stark but stabilizing. Mutual destruction discourages first use. That does not eliminate risk, but it lowers the probability of immediate nuclear exchange in the first 24 hours. Instead, conventional strikes, cyber operations, economic measures, and strategic positioning would likely define the opening phase. If a global war began tomorrow, the first 24 hours would consist of cyber chaos, financial panic, military repositioning, diplomatic urgency, information warfare, and strategic restraint. It would not instantly resemble apocalyptic fiction. It would resemble a fragile balancing act between escalation and survival. World wars are not automatic events. They result from decisions, miscalculations, pride, and breakdowns in communication. The first day would test boundaries and intentions. The following days would determine destiny. The phrase World War III carries deep fear because history demonstrated the catastrophic cost of global conflict. But history also demonstrates something else. Crises can be diffused. Escalations can be contained. Leaders can step back from the brink. The first 24 hours would not define the end of civilization. They would define whether humanity chooses escalation or restraint. War begins with actions, but peace survives through wisdom. Ultimately, the first 24 hours would not be about weapons alone. They would be about decisions, and decisions shape history.